Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining our webinar, Equity in Housing, Meeting and Exceeding California's Fair Housing Requirements. I'm Melissa Keene, a Senior Program Manager with the Institute for Local Government, and I will be your moderator and host this afternoon. California has a commitment to fair and equal housing, and that commitment has been reinforced by the passage of AB 686, requiring public agencies to administer housing and community development programs in a way that further fair housing. This webinar will provide an overview of the fair housing laws, strategies to implement and address these requirements, and the interconnection between fair housing and larger socioeconomic equity and environmental justice issues. Just a quick overview of today's agenda. So we're just going to do a quick welcome and cover some logistics here. We'll talk about setting the stage a little bit, and then we're going to hear presentations from Tyrone Buckley, Isaac Rosen, Lori Droste, and Mohammed Alamuddin. And then we're going to go into a panel discussion with all of our panelists on the call this afternoon, and then we'll have some Q&A from the audience, and then we'll talk through some upcoming webinars and wrap up. So you've probably noticed that your line has been muted, and you'll be muted for the duration of today's call, but that doesn't mean you can't ask us questions. So you should see a questions box in the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. So please drop questions into there at any point during this presentation, and we will get to as many questions as possible at the close of the webinar. One other quick note is that we are recording this webinar this afternoon, and we will be distributing that recording along with the slide deck likely early next week. So just a little bit about ILG before we get started, in case you're not familiar with us. We are the nonprofit training and education affiliate of the League of California Cities, the California State Association of Counties, and the California Special Districts Association. And we provide practical and easy-to-use resources so local agencies can effectively implement policies on the ground. We do this in a number of ways. We provide a lot of education and training, like this webinar that you're on today, and conference sessions and other individual training opportunities. We also provide technical assistance, capacity building, and convening services for local governments statewide. We do this in a variety of areas. Our program areas focus on leadership and governance, which covers some of your state mandated requirements around ethics and sexual harassment training, prevention, and people who are new to public service. We have a suite of materials for those folks. And really helping local government teams operate more effectively. We also have a program focused on civics education and workforce, which helps create the pipeline to public service and help foster municipal school partnerships and get young folks interested in local government as a career path. We have a whole program focused on public engagement, so helping embed public engagement into local government operations and helping you all have some of those difficult conversations with your community around things like housing and climate and other big topics that you're trying to tackle. And then lastly, we have a program focused on sustainable communities, which covers things like housing and the webinar you're on this afternoon, as well as climate action and resilience efforts and energy efficiency, greenhouse gas reductions, and overall sustainability best practices. So again, today's presenters, we're joined by Tyrone Buckley, the Assistant Deputy Director of Fair Housing with HCD, Isaac Rosen, an Associate with Best and Krieger, Lori Droste, who's a council member at the City of Berkeley, and Mohammed Alamuddin, who I will apologize again that I probably just completely mangled your last name even after I asked, who's an Economic Equity Fellow with the Green Lining Institute. So a little bit of information about how ILG connects to this work before we jump into the official presentations. So we are part of a statewide technical assistance program through HCD. And ILG's role is a few things here in this space. So again, we're part of the statewide and regional technical assistance team that has been meeting with regional and local agencies statewide to really identify what some of the barriers to housing development are, some of the challenges you all are facing, and working through the state with the state team to develop regional technical assistance plans to help you all address some of those challenges. Additionally, we're working to update our flagship resource, the Planning Commissioner's Handbook, which should be coming online this fall, most likely. And there will be companion regional trainings that go along with that for planning commissioners statewide. And then lastly, local officials training, which is part of this webinar is part of. It's an ongoing webinar series that will be going through October, and we'll share a little bit more information about the other topics that we'll be covering at the end of this webinar. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Tyrone to kick us off and talk through some of the AB 686 requirements. Tyrone?
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Tyrone Buckley. I'm the Assistant Deputy Director of Fair Housing at HCD. I'm sorry that picture that was shown of me shows me with hair and with glasses, but this is what I look like today. I'm really excited to be here today. I really appreciate the Institute for Local Government inviting us to this meeting. We want to try to get as much outreach as we can out there on AB 686. We know it's a new area of law. For lots of jurisdictions, a matter of first impression, so we want to support folks as much as we can. So thank you for the opportunity. The purpose of my portion of this presentation is to help you understand recent changes in California fair housing law and HC's vision for implementation. While the work of the department has always been deeply connected to addressing fair housing issues, our efforts have become much more intentionally focused on addressing racial equity and broadening access to opportunity with the passage of recent legislation like AB 686. As you'll see, we now have the opportunity to ensure that housing elements are infused with data and actions that will secure increased fair housing choice. In order to provide support and in addition to participating in workshops like these, we released a detailed guidance on implementing the law in April that you can find on our website. It was also accompanied by an AFFH data viewer tool to provide access to data essential to understanding fair housing issues, and I'll talk a little bit about that today too. So now let's start talking about AB 686. Next slide, please. First, the law gives us a very strong definition of affirmatively furthering fair housing. And this comes from federal law. Much of what is in AB 686 is modeled after federal law that came down in 2015 from the Obama administration that was many consider to be the strongest effort to actually implement the Fair Housing Act. In the 50 plus years, the Fair Housing Act has been on the books. And when the Obama administration left and we got a new administration, California recognized that we wanted to codify some of those good things in federal law. So one of the things that we did in AB 686 is we put that strong definition that comes from the federal law of affirmatively furthering fair housing. And so it's defined as taking meaningful actions in addition to combating discrimination that overcome patterns of segregation and foster inclusive communities free from barriers that restrict access to opportunity based on protected characteristics. Next slide, please. So the definition goes on to break that down a little bit more and specifically goes into what are the meaningful actions that we need to accomplish through affirmatively furthering fair housing. And those are addressing significant disparities in housing needs and in access to opportunity, replacing segregated living patterns with truly integrated and balanced living patterns, transforming racially and ethnically concentrated areas of poverty into areas of opportunity, and fostering and maintaining compliance with civil rights and fair housing laws. So now all of that is in California law as the definition of affirmatively furthering fair housing and gives a lot of guidance on what not only sort of what the components of the law is, but really what the spirit of the law is as well. Next slide, please. So that's the definition piece. Let's get into what we call the public entities piece or the public agency piece of AB 686. There are two major components. One is around its impact on public agencies, but there's another component that focuses on housing element law. So first, discussing the public agencies piece. This is a mandate that says that all public agencies must administer programs and activities relating to housing and community development, broadly defined in a manner that affirmatively furthers fair housing and takes no action inconsistent with affirmatively furthering fair housing. It's a broad mandate in the law, and that's the way that we read it. So public agencies are defined in the law, and it's just about everyone you can imagine, whether it's local government, county government, whether it's state government. Everyone needs to make sure that as they administer programs and activities related to housing or community development, they need to be affirmatively furthering fair housing. So for public agencies, that means education departments, that means water departments, that means all of the different components of what we know involve community development. on top of housing departments. We know that means us at HCD. We know that means our sister organizations like CalHFA, SGC, who has housing programs, that we all need to be administering those programs in a way that affirmatively furthers fair housing. Also that programs and activities can be defined very broadly as well. Public agencies need to look at what they're doing and see what qualifies as a program and activity within their scope if they're a housing or community development related agency that triggers their requirement to AFFH. Next slide, please. I do want to note that, actually, before we get out of that, I do want to note that the Obama rule did go away in 2015, and the next administration had new AFFH rules in place. What we understand is the Obama administration is moving forward with not necessarily putting right back in the 2015 rule, but they do have a new interim AFFH rule, and we at HCD are still analyzing sort of what the impact is on the California law that we're going to talk about today. All right. So next slide, thank you. So we're going to talk about the housing element impacts of AB 686 next. So first you have that public agencies piece, and then you have impacts on housing element law. And we're going to talk about 3 of the primary components of the AFFH requirements in housing element law. First, we're going to talk about outreach, then we're going to talk about the assessment of fair housing, and then we're going to talk about the site inventory. Next slide, please. So housing elements have always had a public participation requirement, and they've always had the mandate to reach all economic segments of the population. But now we need to make sure that they describe meaningful, frequent, and ongoing community participation, consultation, and coordination that is integrated and with the broader stakeholder outreach and community participation processes for the overall housing. That means that the public outreach needs to take into account AFFH by including public input on the AFFH sections of the housing and include a summary of fair housing outreach and capacity as part of their AFH. Next slide, please. So jurisdictions should consider the following as they think through their outreach strategy. Think through geographic barriers to participation, especially in geographically large jurisdictions that maybe have a lot of different components to them, like rural areas. Think about in-person meetings in various locations to ensure that residents from across the community have a fair opportunity to participate. Make sure that meeting sites are in transit accessible or have other options to assist residents getting there without access to vehicles. Make sure that meetings are scheduled outside of work hours. This is one we hear a lot about, including on evenings and weekends to facilitate a variety of participation. And to make sure that housing element drafts are made available for public viewing with in-person and electronic options for review and comment with ample time before submission to HCD for review. Next slide, please. Examples of the key stakeholder groups that we want jurisdictions to make sure they engage in. Obviously, this is not a exhaustive list of the folks that we want folks to engage with, but these are some of the ones that certainly we want to put out there in front, which is folks like the public housing authorities, community-based organizations, housing and community development providers, low-income community members and households that include persons in protected classes, fair housing agencies, independent living centers. All of those folks can give you a broad understanding of what's happening with the protected classes in your community. Next slide, please. Next, I want to talk about the sort of the bulk of it, really, which is the assessment of fair housing. The housing element now incorporates planning and analysis around AFFH that we collectively call the assessment of fair housing. And I know that's a little tricky because there was a federal one, but this is what it's called in housing element law as well. There are 5 different analysis areas that really come from the definition that have to be part of your AFFH. So fair housing enforcement and outreach, look at your capacity in your jurisdiction to enforce fair housing law and what kind of outreach you're doing around that. Looking at patterns of segregation and integration within the community, and looking at disparities in access to opportunity in your community. Are all the higher resource areas places where the low income residents or protected classes have access to that opportunity? Disproportionate housing needs and displacement is a big part of this too. Displacement is actually something that wasn't necessarily highlighted in the federal law, and I know in California we made sure to talk a lot about displacement because we know a lot of our communities are going through that now. And then finally, racially and ethnically concentrated areas of poverty. That's also part of the definition. We want to make sure that as we are looking at our communities, we are thinking about where there are already folks clustered and isolated in places. But then we also, another sort of turn of that is to look at what we've been looking at is racially concentrated areas of affluence, recognizing that some of our racial and ethnic concentration isn't around poverty, sometimes it's around affluence. And so to do an analysis of that too, and that's also part of our of the guidebook that we put together. Next slide, please. Actually, I'm sorry, would you go back to the last slide? Thank you. So all these components are part of the AFH. You need to, there are other components in there. You need to come up with a list of contributing factors for to fair housing challenges in your community. You need to develop a set of goals for what the community wants to achieve. And you need to come up with, and this is very common in housing element law, come up with a set of actions, really the programs part of the housing element to address what you found through the fair housing analysis you did in your AFH. Next slide, please. We did not want folks to get too bogged down. We know that it's hard to get access to this data, so we're trying to do as much as we can to support folks in that. So we created this AFFH data viewer as part of our release of our guidance in April. So we created this interactive data tool called the AFFH data viewer to assist jurisdictions and advocates in analyzing fair housing trends. The tool can be accessed from the AFFH webpage on our website. It includes interactive maps with 60+ data layers that folks can toggle on and off. And they're grouped by fair housing issues such as segregation, integration, and so forth, as I mentioned in an earlier slide. There's a how-to guide to assist folks to navigate and use the AFFH data viewer. I'm always a little, it's always a challenge, I think, when these types of tools come out that folks don't know exactly how to use it. So we want to make sure that people who are giving some folks some guidance on how it can be of use to them. It includes functionality that allows people to print and export maps that they create, so sort of an ease of use thing. And it's really supposed to be a living tool. As much as we want this to be support for jurisdictions, they're trying to meet their fair housing obligations, we also want folks in the advocacy community to be using this as well to tell the story of their community and affirmatively furthering fair housing and other folks who are engaged in that discussion. Next slide, please. Lastly, I know we're running out of time, but the last part of it is around the site inventory component of housing element law. The purpose of the housing element site inventory is to identify and analyze specific land that is available and suitable to accommodate the regional housing need by income group. The site identification requirement involves not only an analysis of site capacity to accommodate the RHNA, but also now with 8686, an AFFH component to analyze whether this identified sites serve the purpose of replacing segregated living patterns with truly integrated and balanced living patterns, transforming racially and ethnically concentrated areas of poverty into areas of opportunity, those components that we talked about in the AFH. The identification of sites should be actually directly informed by the AFH. The AFH, that analysis that the jurisdiction does of fair housing, should be part of how they get to a site inventory that AFFH is. And I think one important thing to note is that the site inventory AFFH analysis should not just be limited to the identification of sites for lower income households, but should really be thinking through where housing is going throughout the jurisdiction at all income levels. And it should assess the extent to which the site inventory further entrenches or ameliorates existing patterns of segregation and or exclusion of protected class members. So those are the three pieces. We're going to continue on working on technical assistance for folks. We're working on getting some sample analyses of different situations that cities or counties might find themselves in who have their housing element obligation, so that they can sort of see themselves in one of those samples in order to think through and strategize how they're going to meet their AFFH requirements. And then we're going to continue to update the data viewer. We get feedback on that all the time, creating new data layers. So we'll continue. That'll sort of be a living project for us. And then we're going to continue to participate in discussions like today, but we also are putting on webinars ourselves around our AFFH duties. And we're continuing to demo our data viewer for folks in webinars. So thank you so much for the time today. Really appreciate it. I would just say, just lastly on this last slide, the AFFH guidance at hcd.ca.gov email is the place where you could send us any questions that you have around the guidance or any other feedback you have for us. So I know that was brief. There's a lot in there. I'd be happy to answer any questions as we continue our discussion today. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Tyrone. Looking forward to hearing a little bit more from you during the panel discussion and the Q&A portion. So as a reminder to everybody on the line, definitely feel free to drop in any questions that you have into that questions box. We're monitoring those on the back end, and we'll get to as many as we can during the Q&A portion of the presentation. Next up, we have Isaac from BBK. So Isaac.
Great, thank you so much, Melissa, and thank you, Tyrone, for the presentation, which was incredibly informative. As Melissa mentioned, my name is Isaac Rosen. I am an associate at Best Best & Krieger, based out of the Los Angeles office. I do work, significant work with planning commissions and elected bodies and have a focus on housing. So what I wanted to do this afternoon is to sort of touch on what I would consider sort of companion bills that the legislature has passed in recent years that have a fair housing sort of intent, but are outside of AB 686 as Tyrone presented, and then talk about some pending legislation that's relevant. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, you know, there has been, I wouldn't say a singular focus from the legislature, but we have certainly seen a lot of housing bills that have come in that impact local agencies in recent years. And the ones that I'll be talking about today in terms of existing laws are ones that, in my estimation, are based on the Legislative Digest, are an attempt to reach the same result as AB 686, but have sort of alternative ways to doing so. Next slide, please. So I thought it would be good to just mention AB 101, which is several years old now, but it's sort of relevant to what Tyrone was presenting on. AB 101 provided greater tools to HCD in the state to enforce essentially the need for local agencies to get their housing element in and get it approved and ensure it's compliant with all local laws and state laws, including obviously affirmative fair housing. So AB 101 sort of opened up this opportunity for HCD to have the equivalent of a meet and confer with municipalities to the extent they have a non-compliant housing element or an housing element that hasn't been timely submitted for review. And it allows HCD to actually sort of refer non-compliant housing elements and within municipalities in the state to the California Attorney General, who can go through a series of actions as part of a court order to try to impose increasingly sort of harsh penalties on a municipality that you'll see are listed here following the retention by the court of jurisdiction. And I mention this because, you know, we are clearly seeing a move to ensure that the state has the tools in their toolbox to enforce some of these requirements with respect to what I consider sort of twin housing crises in the state. You have the affordability crises, and then you separately have the housing stock crises, which are obviously related, but AB 101 is one I mentioned just because it has enforcement repercussions. And that can go all the way up to a court-appointed receiver who could, in theory, come in and work with a municipality to try to get their housing element in compliance. Next slide, please. I do a significant amount of work in my practice on surplus land and AB 1486, which was adopted in 2019. I mention it because it has similar goals as affirmative fair housing in terms of the ability to try to address those housing crises in the state. It used to be that a local agency had broad authority to declare a parcel surplus and sell it off for economic development purposes. AB 1486 essentially closed that popular loophole and said if the surplus property is no longer necessary for the agency's use, you have to go through a process where housing sponsors and other local public entities get the first bite of the apple to develop affordable housing and try to ease the housing crises in the state. And so there's certain notice requirements for a local agency and then a required 90-day good faith negotiation period if a housing sponsor has notified HCD that they have interest in potential surplus sites and intend to build affordable units on those sites. Next slide, please. I'm sure SB 330 is not news to anyone that's listening in on this webinar. It's been quite a significant undertaking for local public agencies to ensure compliance with the new streamlined provisions. This is another local bill I wanted, a recently enacted bill I thought was worth mentioning because again, I think some of these housing related bills passed by the legislature have the intent of trying to make it easier to build housing, particularly affordable housing. The SB 330 made existing law changes to the Permit Streamlining Act and Housing Accountability Act, and then codified this new Housing Crisis Act. And essentially, the impacts, next slide, please, really are to limit the amount of local discretion involved in the process for housing development applicants. They receive a freeze at the time on development standards at the time they submit a deemed complete preliminary application or application, and what the local agency can ask for within those materials is limited also by state statute now. So there's just an impetus now, or I guess I should say a requirement for local agencies to really work through streamlining the process for housing developers to build housing and to remove some barriers. Well, I should say barriers is a subjective tone, but you know, the purpose of the legislation was to try to make it easier to get housing development projects approved. Next slide, please. And these are just some of those additional changes that were impacted by the law. There's certain rezoning limitations, hearing limitations, and it really severely limits the ability of a local agency to impose a growth control measure or moratorium. Next slide, please. Okay, and AB 1561 is a relatively new, recently passed law, and I thought it was an interesting one to highlight following Tyrone's presentation because he did talk a bit about the analysis areas required for affirmatively furthering fair housing under the housing element. AB 1561 would allow HCD discretionarily, it's not a mandatory obligation, but they could require a local agency to also analyze constraints on providing housing for persons who qualify with protected characteristics under the state's Civil Rights Act. And I left a bullet point here to also just say there's another requirement in that bill about identifying at least one zone in the local agency's jurisdictions where emergency shelters are a permitted use that don't require discretionary review. The bills I highlighted were to just, again, drive home that, you know, we've seen quite a big focus from the legislature on trying to make housing development easier, and not only easier, but affirmatively furthering fair housing, as Tyrone's discussed. And so these were meant to sort of address some of those considerations by the legislature. Next slide, please. And now we will be talking about a couple pending bills. Next slide. So AB 1304 just clarifies AB 686, which we were just talking about. It just makes clear that this is a mandatory duty to comply with affirmatively furthering fair housing laws. So it's just a cleanup measure, but I think it speaks to, again, the drive for the state to really ensure that these are carried out by local agencies, that the analysis that Tyrone was discussing is something that's taken seriously, and that there are tools, obviously, to enforce those requirements. And it also adds some additional broader analysis than what's currently required under the law. Tyrone talked a bit about site inventory with RHNA numbers. That's something that would be bolstered in terms of the required analysis under this new bill that's currently being considered. Next slide, please. This is probably similar to SB 330, SB 9, making its way through the legislature is probably something that is top of mind and is getting a fair amount of attention because SB 9 would, subject to certain limitations, would make a housing application for 2 units to essentially split a single family home in a single family residential zone, making that approval process ministerial. So there's been iterations of this in past years that haven't made it out into law, but it would be obviously a pretty seismic change to add to the government code a requirement that no discretionary review is necessary if you were going to split a single family residential home into 2 units. It's subject to certain objective development and zoning standards. So in that way, I think of it as similar to certain obligations under the state density bonus law, where a local agency is essentially obligated to issue certain concessions and incentives for a developer based on the building of affordable housing. I should note there is no express affordability requirement, at least in the current iteration of the bill I reviewed, which I think is why there's been a fair amount of criticism with respect to the bill. But obviously the purpose in opening up single family zoning to this sort of ministerial approval that really looks very similar to how accessory dwelling units are approved would obviously be to create more housing and try to ease those housing crises. And I should note the current version of the bill does have a couple objective carve outs, even though it's fast moving in terms of the changes. Right now, the bill as currently drafted would not apply to certain wetlands and very high fire hazard zones as defined by CAL FIRE. And it would not apply to housing development where there would be sort of a demolition of existing housing. But it's a big bill, and it's drawing a lot of strong feelings on both sides, and it's certainly one to watch. Next slide, please. And the last pending bill I wanted to just mention is SB 10. As it's written on these slides, it would allow a local agency to adopt an ordinance that would allow up to 10 units of residential density per parcel. And that's specific to a transit-rich area or urban infill site as defined. But I would note the definition under state law of an urban infill site is very broad. It essentially means most developed parcels to the extent their perimeter is already developed and it's not an agricultural or rural use. And then a transit-rich area pops up in some of the enacted state laws recently. It essentially means any place where there is a existing rail or mass transit stop or a bus that's runs relatively frequently. You know, this does contemplate a permissive right for local agencies that they could adopt an ordinance that really substantially increased density, you know, to build housing. But the bill contemplates that if you were going to approve an ordinance, if the legislative body was going to approve an ordinance to that effect, they need to look at whether the increased density is going to affirmatively further fair housing. And I was struck by what Tyrone mentioned about the analysis and looking not only at racial and ethnically concentrated poverty, but also racial and ethnic clusters of affluence. So I think, you know, the bill, the AFFH bill, is going to have implications for state law going forward, and this is one of those instances, should it pass. And I would note that as written, SB 10 currently could, with a supermajority of the legislative body, supersede a more limiting local voter initiative. And I want to also note, I'm not sure I mentioned this on the previous slide with SB 9, but in that case and SB 10, in both instances, when we're talking about either splitting single family homes into additional homes, or here really upping the density involved with parcels, one of the critiques for both these bills is it doesn't count the obligations that already exist for local agencies with respect to accessory dwelling units or junior accessory dwelling units, otherwise known as granny flats. So there's already state law that allows a by right ministerial approval of most ADUs or JADUs. The junior ADUs are within the existing primary dwelling. So when we're talking about the potential for these bills to pass, it's not only creating more potential residential units based on the limits in the bills themselves, but it also means the ability already for the owner or applicant on that parcel to build, a detached or attached ADU, or to create a JADU within the actual dwelling unit itself. And so next slide, that is the end of my presentation, and look forward to chatting with everyone afterwards.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Isaac. So now that we've talked through kind of some of the legal groundwork and what's working its way through the legislature now, we're going to turn to a little bit more local focus and talk about what this looks like on the ground for our local government partners. So we're going to hear from the City of Berkeley and what they are currently doing. I'm going to turn it over to Vice Mayor Lori Droste. Lori?
Well, hello, and thank you so much for having me here. So in Berkeley, we decided to approach equitable zoning reform in conjunction with our housing element update after passing a resolution to end exclusionary zoning by 2022. Before I work through these presentation slides, I want to first address why I put forward an equitable zoning item and give you a little bit of background about our city, and then we'll move through the slides. So, I don't need to tell all of you that the Bay Area in California is in the midst of an incredible shortage of homes, a shortage of both subsidized affordable homes and non-subsidized market rate units. In the Bay Area alone, there's one home added for every 3.5 jobs, and California ranks 49th in the United States in terms of housing per capita. So in Berkeley, the median home price is $1.4 million, and we've seen skyrocketing homelessness to the tune of a couple thousand individuals. So we know throughout many of our cities, including Berkeley, low-income people and middle-income people and their families can't afford to live in our communities. And many endure super commutes of 90 minutes or more just to work in our city. And not only that, we have rent and childcare costs tallying up to thousands of dollars a month. So to give you a little bit of background here in Berkeley, in the early 1900s, if you've ever been to Berkeley, you see hundreds of beautiful craftsman homes, in addition to bungalow courts and fourplexes and small apartment buildings, and they were built throughout the city. My neighborhood, the area in which I represent, is home to many of these types of structures, which are now currently banned under our zoning laws. And just to give you a bit of background around that, Berkeley and the neighborhood that I represent in the Elmwood is known as being the birthplace of single-family zoning. And an ordinance, and the city attorney at that time said that was put into place to protect against the less desirable and floating renter class. Although explicit discrimination was banned in 1917, it was replaced by, of course, what we know as redlining, and many of these laws were actually put into Berkeley's books to prevent African-American dance halls in the neighborhood that I represent now, and to ban Chinese laundromats from relocating to this part of town. And so if you look at the maps from those times to now, you'll see that there's a fair amount of overlap. Prior to the 1970s, you know, we had many homes were built, but then the city of Berkeley passed a preservation ordinance, and a variety of missing middle type of housing, those duplexes and triplexes, were essentially became much harder to create throughout Berkeley. And it severely restricted multi-unit housing throughout Berkeley. And so what we've seen over the past few decades is a gradual racial and economic segregation of our community, and the massive displacement of our historically large Black population. I was just on the phone this morning with a reporter who was noting that our kindergarten classes in Berkeley have half the amount of Black students as our senior class at Berkeley High School. And at one point, Berkeley High School was the most racially diverse high school in the nation. And so the work done in here at UC at the Othering and Belonging Institute they've issued an extensive report directly pointing out the connection between racial and economic exclusion and the percentage of land dedicated to single family zoning. So all of this is to say is, so what I did is I posed this question to my colleagues on City Council. Given what we know about the racial and economic exclusionary effects of single family zoning, do we think it's a problem? And it turns out that my colleagues agreed that exclusionary zoning is something that we wanted to rectify and committed to do so in 2022. But as you may know, resolutions are symbolic. So now then we had a subsequent conversation, and how do we proceed? And that's what I want to talk to you about today. So we decided to address this issue when we update our housing element. So this, as you can see from the slides, and we'll now move through the slides, you know, many people said, well, you know, we're not going to solve the housing crisis by just focusing on neighborhoods. We need to look at the city. And we say, you know what, you're absolutely right. So let's do this as we're updating our housing element. So as I'm sure many of you know, a housing element is required by state law and essentially provides an analysis of a community's housing needs for all income levels and strategies to respond to those housing needs. So we'll go to the next slide. So across California, we are seeing cities sort of have this conversation. So Berkeley is not unique. We may be unique in the fact that we sort of began this conversation before everyone else in the state of California, but every city is going to have a conversation about how we're going to address the housing affordability crisis and the climate crisis moving forward. So let's go to the next slide. So in Berkeley in particular, we have to accommodate approximately 9,000 homes. It's around 6,000 more than the previous cycle. And many cities have seen significant increases and requirements due to a Senate Bill 828, which increased the amount of homes that cities need to accommodate in the years moving forward. Let's go to the next slide. So the question is, you know, how do we plan for our future? How do we plan for our children? And how do we accommodate what we're seeing in terms of displacement, increased racial and economic segregation, skyrocketing housing prices, and homelessness throughout our city? So let's go to the next slide. So what we decided to do is undertake this community process. So as you probably know, the housing element, people are required to engage within a community process when we're updating the housing element. We wanted to begin this process earlier. Of course, we want to prioritize homes in priority development areas near transit. But we also want to look at those pockets of our community that are essentially walling off a significant portion of our population. And those are areas in single family zones only. Next slide. Okay, so when cities have, when many cities are engaging in this conversation around zoning, a lot of individuals want to know what type of public input will be allowed and required. So anytime there's a housing element update, it's stated that you must engage the community and have significant outreach. So and oftentimes when you're putting forward zoning revisions in general, you have to have staff outreach to affected communities and public hearings, especially if we're going to adopt broad scale zoning revisions. Of course, we have to undertake environmental analyses, and the legislation that we passed explicitly mentions communities of concern, various commissions and stakeholders to engage. So as we're undertaking this process, we certainly want to hear from the community and figure out the best ways in which to move forward. Next slide, please. So a lot of questions that perhaps we'll receive today are around equity and affordability. Equity in terms of geography. So why are larger buildings allowed in some parts of town and not others? And which it points to a broader equity issue, because many times where we have higher density housing are in BIPOC communities. So to begin a conversation around equity and to talk about affordability. So many times we hear from individuals saying, well, when we're pursuing these zoning changes, there's not an explicitly stated mandated affordability requirement. What's interesting is that currently, because of single family zoning, affordable housing is barred, right? So what we're saying is we want to allow the flexibility to pursue subsidized housing if we are able to do that. But right now, the other option is a $1.4 million home. That's the median price in Berkeley. So in talking about affordability, we engaged with tenant experts, and we have a great anti-displacement organization here at UC Berkeley, and they strongly urged us to move through the process and pursue a path to allow maximum flexibility. We've seen with our accessory dwelling unit laws that those become more accessible to individuals with middle incomes, more so than a single family home. So if you look at housing types and income that one needs to afford these particular housing types, clearly a home within a duplex is going to be less expensive than a single family home. And so we've been able to extract data to show that correlation as well. So in this process, we said we absolutely want to pursue a variety of community benefits and just making sure that we can deliver a package that is feasible to our community. Next slide. So one thing in Berkeley in particular, and I believe this has been a conversation with Senate Bill 9, is how do we go about in assuring people that we're going to address public safety concerns. That absolutely is a concern of ours. Our existing review, when we're undertaking zoning revisions, is we have our local hazard mitigation plan, disaster preparedness and safety plan. We use CAL FIRE, their land use planning and assistance, and we have a required legal environmental analysis when we're undergoing zoning changes. So absolutely, we want to make sure that we're taking into account the public safety needs of our community. Let's go to the next slide. So one area that is a really interesting dovetail between equity and public safety is many areas that are currently zoned single family home are either in wildfire areas or adjacent to it. So what we are saying is clearly we want to implement public safety standards, but we want to have objective and not subjective standards. So just because an area may be adjacent or close to a wildfire area, but maybe has wide roads and easily accessible evacuation routes, we're not saying just because it's in this particular upscale area that we're gonna say these zoning revisions don't apply. So we really are trying to be very careful in ensuring the public safety of our community, but making sure that we're approaching this with objective standards and not subjective sort of political boundaries. Next slide. So one thing that that is often not talked about is how housing policy is climate policy. We're very fortunate in our zoning revision package that we have the support of a climate researcher and Nobel Prize winner, Dan Kamen, who does a lot of the work at Cal here, and a wide variety of environmental organizations. And that's because of this supercommuter effect and the fact that transportation emissions account for the bulk of our GHGs in Berkeley. And so if you look at the Cool Climate Lab at Berkeley and you see what is the one policy that local governments can undertake to positively benefit the climate within Berkeley, it is in creating infill housing, creating opportunities for people to live so they don't have to commute long distances. Next slide. So one thing that we've heard a fair amount about is design and scale and neighborhood character, however you want to define that. But I'd like to point out this picture here is a fourplex in my district, currently barred in many parts of the city, and may in fact be barred in the neighborhood that it sits in right now. So as you can see, there are many beautifully designed homes that fit into neighborhoods. In many cases, might be the size of a large single family home, but maybe a grandmother wants to duplex her home and have her grandchildren move in to the adjoining unit. That currently is barred. So we wanted to make sure that we incentivize adaptive reuse and have contextual additions, because that's one thing that we heard is that people really care about architecture, and we care about that as well. And what we're saying is these missing middle housing types don't preclude the beauty that we have seen throughout Berkeley. Next slide. Another concern that was raised to us was tenant protections. Now, SB 330 has some tenant protections, but we've also heard that we want to ensure that that we're not going to displace anyone. In a displacement risk analysis in Portland, Oregon, who undertook similar zoning reform measures, we actually saw that the displacement of low-income individuals actually lessened by up to 25%. So we want to make sure that tenants are protected, and that's certainly going to be part of any package that the City of Berkeley puts forward, because it's not just a production measure, but we want to make sure that we're preserving and preventing displacement as well. Next slide. And in terms of the zoning concepts, again, we want to, I don't claim to say that this is going to be the silver bullet that's going to solve everything. It's not. In fact, when we pursue these types of modest changes in our neighborhoods, it'll probably take 10 to 20 years to even notice that there's a duplex in an area that currently is barred. But what we can do is ensure that we grow our city equitably, and that we prioritize growth near transit corridors and priority development areas. And that's something that we want our Planning Commission to pursue. Next slide. All right, so that'll do it. On my website, you'll see there's an issues tab that's under equitable zoning reform. There's a frequently asked question section, an interesting article about a local legend in Berkeley, Dorothy Walker, who helped desegregate schools and also has been advocating for zoning reform for decades. And so if you go to that tab in my website, you'll find a lot of information there. And so thank you so much for having me here.
Great. Thank you so much, Lori. Really appreciate you sharing what you're working on in Berkeley to help kind of contextualize some of these concepts. And last but not least, we're going to hear from the Greenlining Institute, give a little bit more of the community perspective as we work through some of these issues. So, Mohammed?
Hello, everyone. My name is Mohammed El Modin, and I'm the Economic Equity Fellow for the Greenlining Institute. I mostly work in housing, non-bank lending reform, federal CRA, also with innovative policy proposals like baby bonds, other housing production strategies, and the sorts, anything with economic equity. A quick overview of the Greenlining Institute is that it was founded in the 1990s by Black, Latinx, AAPI, and disability rights activists in Oakland, California, basically to create, we need to come together to uplift our communities, right? So the Greenlining Institute envisions a future where communities of color can build wealth, live in healthy places filled with economic opportunity, and are ready to meet with the challenges posed by climate change. We kind of act as an incubator for new policy ideas. We're a bridge builder between people, communities, and government, and we're an advocate to build momentum for transformative change. Because economic opportunity has so many parts and they all connect, we work on a majority of policy issues, from economic to environmental policy, healthcare, and many others. We don't see these issues as being separate silos, but as interconnected trends. We work with community-based organizations currently in Oakland with the BIPOC Small Business Network, Santa Cruz for environmental equity, the city of Stockton, and San Diego for similar initiatives with the environment. I'm here today and feel blessed to follow Vice Mayor Droste, who's the representative of my district, to talk about how we could work with community-based organizations, right? And I'm sorry I don't have PowerPoint, but I feel like at this point, as the last speaker, everyone is already PowerPointed out. So I just want to start with a thought exercise, right? Like, imagine your grandpa chopped down a tree and tore apart like your neighbor's home, and then your father came by and flooded it. And now you have to repair this home. You have to go over there, repair it, but you decide to go over there without stating how your family has wronged them. You try to build the home without your neighbor's input, and you repair the home without compensating them for their time and convenience and for the construction. And sometimes you just leave the home as it is. And this sounds like, no one would really do this, but this is how most governments deal with the local community. And communities of color, after years of displacement, urban renewal, redlining highways going through their districts from city governments, there's no protections for what's going on, and this impacts their wealth building opportunities, their health outcomes, their technology access, walkability of the neighborhood. It's a lot for them. And this is a chance for local governments, especially with local housing elements being implemented, AFFH requirements, start working with the communities that have been wronged for so long. So if you go to their house, or if this happened to you and your house was hurt, how do you expect this person to show up after they have seriously wronged you? First, you want them to state that they've done something wrong. So number one tip when it comes to working with local community, especially when it comes to zoning reform, is that the local government in their outreach materials for the public must address the past injustices. You have to address the problem. You can't just sweep it under the rug. They deal with this problem day in and day out, and they know the government has caused this. So by addressing the problem in their outreach materials, you must state the historic and racist local practices and how this has created suffering within the community and what the city is seeking to remedy these injustices, right? So this shows accountability, and it also is the first step to gaining any trust with this community, addressing what's wrong. Explicitly state that equity as a core concept and state out like indicators of equity, right? Like what the city plans to do to ensure that people are part of the process. Community engagement plans, collaborative governance structures, anti-displacement strategies. And it's also important for the local government to have an internal guiding document on public engagement practices and to train staff on how to deal with impacted communities. So there isn't miscommunication, because as you know, there are some staff members that really care about racial justice and some that really don't. And really everyone needs to be on the same page, because you have to work with these communities, that they are your constituents. A big recommendation is that local government staff should at least attend one meeting with every community-based partner organization, and just partner with them to understand their scope of work, their expertise, and the constituency that they're accountable for. And it goes without mentioning that any outreach materials that the city does before any zoning reform should be accessible in that community's language. Zoning reform is a touchy subject for communities of color, because when there's zoning reform, communities of color are the first hurt and the last to benefit. And that is true across the scale. So you hurt your neighbor, you addressed what was wrong. You really want to bring another neighbor to like help establish trust, because neighbor doesn't like you. So local government should do the same thing. They should invite community partners to participate in decision-making meetings. So from the beginning of the project design all the way to implementation, and provide them with equal decision-making authority to create a democratic process. And also, if you're going to work with local community, it's our biggest recommendation to have an equity facilitator or an equity consultant. For all of the cities that I've mentioned for greenlining, they have brought us in as an equity consultant to work with local communities, because there's just so much distrust between the local government and the communities that they serve. There has to be a facilitator. This creates a welcoming environment for the BIPOC community. And because now they see that they're prioritized, they have someone on staff focusing on this. And let me see. And local government should schedule time to connect with residents and CBO partners via one-on-one meetings, retreats, to establish individual relationships and trust for the larger group dynamic. It's really important for this outside facilitator, before you even get, is to find someone that's trusted by the community, who has an accountability record, is able to hold emotional space for valid grievances, and is focused on creating tangible benefits for underrepresented communities. But it's also important to be upfront on what the local government can do. Don't overpromise. You can't go over to your neighbor's house after a tree went, it flooded, and you're like, look, I'm gonna build you a mansion, and you don't have the money. It doesn't work like that. Every beginning of every movie turns out wrong, turns out bad. You already know this. And you don't want it, and it's good to be upfront on the capacity and jurisdiction of what the local government could do. And you don't want it to end up where you start working with community partners and you end up not listening to their suggestions, because they already lack trust. They already try to work with you and you're not listening to them. So they're going to decide not to work with the city again. And that has happened so many times. And it's also important to lay out timelines, who are the approvers for certain points, and what is trying to do. And to just state, like, when we get to this point of the process, I lose power, and this is the person that's going to take my place. And I could go to the next slide now, actually. So, yeah. I saw this from Movement Strategy, the spectrum of community engagement to ownership. Really, you want to reach 4 or 5 as a city government. And I'm going to keep this up so everyone can read it while I'm talking. You really want to delegate power. You want there to be community ownership, especially when it comes to a lot of the processes that you're trying to do as local government. And it also goes to our third part. If you're going to work with a community-based organization to help with outreach to low-income or communities of color, you have to compensate them, right? Like if you destroy this house with a tree, you can't just not pay construction workers. Like they're building what you've done wrong, so you have to pay them. So you have to fund the CBO, either through a multi-year grant that you found and provided. You don't send them a list of grants, you get those grants for them, or hire members within their organization with contracts, multi-year contracts, so they could focus on ensuring outreach materials are shared and working with the community. CBOs have the trust and outreach skills to speak with residents better than pretty much anyone. And local government should develop roles, expectations, desired outcomes, and agreements for how to work together, including conflict resolution when it comes to CBO partners in the very beginning. Also give them enough time to do good work. Don't give them 6 months to like solve like housing problems that's going on. That's a good example. You can't like have just speedy turnarounds for planning processes and grant applications and rush the community engagement process. And just remember that the community knows best on how to uplift themselves, and our job is to show how we can help. It's important not to overpromise and to be upfront on how we can effectively change at the moment. When the work gets done, it's also important to relay that the information that's been effectively solved. And yeah, that's mostly how you work with CBOs. Compensate them. Okay, be upfront with what you need, work with the local community, address your injustices, pay them, pay the people that help you, and really just relay the results. And also I'd like to say that when it comes to the housing space, there are two main problems that a lot of local jurisdictions have to face. Number one is that homeowners care about their property values. They do not care about building more housing unless it benefits them. It's the reason why during this housing crisis where homes are $800,000, that the only thing that's been passed at the state level is ADUs, because ADUs build wealth for homeowners, right? So to circumvent that challenge is basically like I'm working with a few partners to look at like a housing swap initiative, basically where the person who owns the land could sell it to a developer in exchange for 2 or 3 units. And if there's a tenant on the property, they could buy one of the units. More on that will come at a later date. Just contact me via email and I could send you the fund materials. Number 2, ensuring racial equity throughout the process. A lot of what the Vice Mayor has laid out and all the other people on this panel is how to ensure equity throughout the process. Another big thing that the Greenlining Institute is researching is ensuring workforce development. When it comes to building anything housing, there's not enough people of color or small builders that are people of color for these small zoning changes. There's like contracts that the county could implement to help workforce development. There could be a pipeline between a contractor to become a small builder. We need more small builders within our community because that builds wealth. It creates trust because you know who's building within your community. They might be your neighbor. And at the same time, it's a huge opportunity for BIPOC wealth to be accumulated. And yeah, I'm pretty much done with my presentation.
Great, thank you so much, Mohammed. So now we're going to move into kind of a panel discussion and Q&A. So I'm going to go ahead and take down the slide deck here for a little bit so that you can see people's cameras. So again, to those folks in the audience, please feel free to drop in any additional questions that you have, and we will, again, get to as many as we can. And I will also share everybody's contact information towards the end of the presentation so that you can follow up with us as needed. But to kind of keep going in the vein of Mohammed's presentation, a lot of you have talked about community engagement and the importance of engaging with your community, whether that's through community-based organizations or increased requirements around your housing element updates from the state. Can you all just speak a little bit more to that in terms of any suggestions you have to either alleviate community concerns around housing development. We hear that a lot from the local governments that we work with, is that anytime that there's a housing proposal, particularly affordable housing, communities are not always the most receptive to that. So any thoughts that you all have to alleviate some of those concerns, or any approaches that you might suggest folks on the line take when having those conversations with their communities? Or Lori, do you want to speak to anything that you have done specifically in Berkeley? I'm sure you guys worked through this with the zoning changes.
Right. So we're going to be undertaking that process right now. And what's really helpful is because it coincides with the housing element process, we're able to have this engagement throughout our community, right? So we are required to engage, and we should engage with all of our community members, and really make sure that we make an effort to reach those who don't normally attend city council meetings. So we know that that sometimes people have conflicts. Zoom has made it much easier in many cases for people to participate in community meetings, but oftentimes families have to put their children to bed. They have to work a shift during the time in which we meet. And so we want to make sure that we reach those people as well. In addition to that, let's just be honest, there's a generational divide as well for those who are more receptive to new homes. And we want to make sure that we reach not only our long-term senior residents who might be concerned, and there are many who are supportive as well, but also reach younger people and younger families. And so making sure that we have a broad cross-section. And so we're really engaging in that community outreach through a variety of means, through our city staff outreach, through organizational outreach, through council members, and we plan on continuing that throughout this entire process. When we first put this forward, we said we wanted to engage in an 18-month process so we could dovetail it with our housing element update. And so that is certainly a big concern of ours, and we want to make sure that everyone's voices are heard and incorporated into our vision.
I unmuted myself. That's a very good point, Lori, that you definitely want to make sure you're engaging with all segments of your community, not just the loudest few that may come to your council meetings, week after week, and really be thinking through different strategies and approaches to reach the different generational components and the different demographics that really will be impacted by some of these decisions. Tyrone, I'm curious if you might be able to speak a little bit to some of the changes to the requirements around engagement on the housing element side of things. I know you spoke a little bit to that in terms of, again, reaching beyond the usuals, but anything else you want to share in terms of the changes or things folks should be thinking about as they go through that process?
Sure. I really appreciated what the council member had to say and what Mom had to say about what you could do to properly engage with folks in your community. I know this has been a part of housing element law and before the AFFH requirement, and one that I think jurisdictions certainly had mixed results in being able to achieve in the outreach component. I'm a former advocate at the local level and at the state level, and so I've gotten to see some of that stuff firsthand. I think making sure that you are reaching out to folks specifically about the AFFH components of your housing element is really important. Broad generalized questions that are aimed at getting the community experience are good to some degree, but as communities are finding out things, looking at the data, as jurisdictions looking at data, looking at potential actions to take, programs to implement in order to address those, to be talking to the community about those and getting feedback specifically on those pieces, I think is going to be a big piece of this. I think we'll be looking for the types of efforts that Mohammed raised and the council member raised, that demonstrate that real diligent effort has been made to reach out and think about protected classes, think about inclusion, think about displacement, because it's essential. It is an essential piece of the AFFH component. It is not just something that's a nice thing to do. You literally could not do a good AFFH analysis without talking to your community and talking to all the folks who will be impacted by an AFFH analysis. So it's essentially important, and there are a lot of tools out there and a lot of folks who will help you.
Perfect. So to follow up with that and kind of going back to Mohammed's presentation, you brought up the idea of an equity coordinator or that type of role that local governments might be able to engage with. Do you have any recommendations for the folks on the line in terms of how are you seeing local governments pay for that or build that into their processes? Any kind of initial steps folks could be taking as they think through engaging with equity coordinators or other similar folks?
Yeah, totally. Oh, that was the question to me, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. Just making sure. There's a lot of grants out there that the local government could pursue. There's also, I understand that the budget concerns are a huge part of the problem, right? So like really including equity into your staff hiring process is important. Really just having someone dedicated to ensure equity, someone committed to that, a point person, makes all the difference. Really, like if you're able to provide a grant and have a local CBO work on it, or to have an outside facilitator to help mend a lot of the relationships, that's the best course of action. And really, like there's even minor stuff in equity, right? Like I have my shirt right here, it's pay our interns, right? I wasn't able to intern in my hometown of Stockton, California until Mayor Tubbs had a paid internship program. And that's how I was a person from the community that was able to influence change of what's going on. So I think like even small things like that make a world of a difference, but really grants and having a dedicated person, contracting people within the organization to work on equity is the best course forward. Number 2 would be equitable staff hiring.
So thinking a little bit outside the box, it's not just necessarily hiring a consultant to come in and do this, but thinking through your hiring practices, thinking through your recruitment practices, job descriptions perhaps even, just so thinking about your internal operations as a city or county or district as they're trying to navigate some of these issues, it sounds like. Could be a good first step.
Yeah, and even if you have the money, hire someone from that local CBO to do the work. That's the best thing you could do. Someone from the community, knows the community, works with the community. That is how you make your process a whole lot easier if you're trying to do zoning reform. Because for the last 30 years, apartments were only zoned in 20% of the land, mostly where people of color lived. They have been displaced or have been displacing. The whole state's gentrifying, honestly. And the other 80% isn't. And we have faced the blunt of housing production. And there has to be a way to mend that. And that's why AFFH is so important. For the other 80% of the land, mostly white wealthier areas, to start having more housing production. It's a white supremacy problem when it comes to the housing space.
Thank you for that. Got a couple of questions here. Tyrone or Isaac, these are probably more directed at you in terms of clarifying some of the requirements around AFFH. So can you clarify a little bit more about what is required to be included in their housing elements? Should they be including goals and action plans? Can you just speak a little bit to what would be required in those housing element updates?
Sure. So already it's a little tricky when you read the law, and that's why we try to demystify it a bit in our guidance. When you read the law, it doesn't necessarily align with the existing components of housing elements, but it actually does. It fits pretty neatly into the existing components. So for instance, the programs and actions is an existing piece of your housing element. Now you need to have programs and actions that AFFH. So generally in your housing element, you're going to do an analysis of your community and develop some, figure out what the challenges are, create some goals around them, and then create some programs to actually alleviate those. With AB 686, it turns very squarely to things like racial equity and affirmatively furthering for housing and opening up communities. I will say that one of the shortcomings of some of the elements that we've seen so far is that even when the assessment of the fair housing issues in the community is relatively strong, sometimes those programs and actions aren't actually directly related to even what they found in their community. So if you're going to do a robust analysis of the fair housing issues in your community and make sure that the programs and actions are directly related to those that are aimed at solving those issues. And then it's also important to make sure that those programs have timetables and a clear path for implementation in the 8-year cycle.
Perfect. Thank you for that clarification. Looking at the time, so I'm going to go ahead and put up our contact information as we go through our last couple questions here. Also just flagging here, I know we were talking about community engagement a little bit here, but the next webinar in this series is going to focus solely on strategies to engage your community on these topics. So if you're interested in learning more there, definitely check that out. And then we'll also be talking about climate resilient land use practices and strategies to work through homelessness, the homelessness crisis as well. So stay tuned for those. But just going to go ahead and throw up everybody's emails there so you can follow up with us after the fact if you have any outstanding questions or we weren't able to get to your question today. But the final question I have for you all is I'm hoping we can kind of do a quick round robin here. I'm curious from each of your perspectives, what would be one thing that you would suggest that local governments can do now to really help plan for and design more equitable communities? Is there one piece of advice or one key thing that you would share with the folks on the line to really move the needle on this?
Well, I'll just add one thing helpful for our community is to have a conversation. So much of the past few around our BIPOC communities, patterns of systemic in our land use forms, but be open to having these conversations with individuals. You know, I think one of the most effective things that I've been able to say to individuals is that just because we want to undo exclusionary zoning, we want to move beyond single family zoning, doesn't mean that we're banning single family homes, right? That's the big misconception, is that I've had people email me and say, how dare you, get rid of our single family zoning? And I look on the map and they actually live in an area that is not single family zoned. So being able to have difficult conversations with people, but also listening as well, because many of these individuals in our communities have good faith concerns for a wide variety of reasons. Perhaps it's decades of discrimination and oppression. Perhaps it's, concern around fire safety. And as long as we can have collaboration with the understanding that we're going to move forward towards equity, it may make people uncomfortable, but I think it's an important conversation to have, and just be willing to have these conversations.
Perfect. Anybody else have advice, Tyrone or Mohammed, Isaac?
I'd be happy to go next unless Isaac wants to go. Looks like he's chomping at the bit. Oh, you're on mute.
Yep.
Okay, yeah, chomping at the bit just to say a very lawyerly response, which is work with your counsel. There's a lot, we heard a lot today about existing state laws and things that are in the pipeline. There's quite a bit of
If you want to mute again.
Yeah.
you're up to date on the standards, including fair housing and all of those sort of companion bills, so that you can ensure you're in compliance and self-preservation, obviously, but also to make sure you're following some of these new guidelines that have come in sort of fast and furious in the last couple of years.
Always good advice to consult with counsel.
Go see your lawyer. That both of those resonated with me. I heard they were I hope I'm not as choppy as some of those were, but I heard pieces of them. I think there are certainly good elements there. I would just remind folks that, AFFH is about legacy. It's about a legacy of racism and segregation, and a tough legacy that we have spent a very long time trying not to look at. And this is the moment where you have to look at. And you cannot be compliant with the law now in California as you do your planning without taking it seriously. And so we're there. There's no looking away. I mean, this is a law that was passed in 1968, only after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King. And then we had 50 years of really implementing it poorly, despite some efforts by some really good people. This is a long haul. This is something our country struggled to do, our states struggled to do, our communities have struggled to do for a long time. So take it seriously and don't resist it, and ask for help. Ask us for help at HCD. Ask the resources that Mohammed laid out for help. You can get through this. You can do a good job on this. You can change your communities for the better, and this is the time to do it.
Okay. Any final thoughts, Mohammed? You haven't had a chance to respond yet.
No. I'd love to echo what everyone has brought on so far. I really just my one thing would be the 3 Ps are really important. So it's really production, preservation, protection, and these 3 work hand in hand. Every city should copy and expand on the anti-displacement and tenant protections that the city of Berkeley has, and other in San Francisco. At the same time, it shouldn't be impossible to build. There needs to be an end on exclusionary zoning. Different types of housing needs to be built. And we need to preserve what's affordable now, because as the Vice Mayor has mentioned, that it's going to take decades for us to see the results of production. And it's really important for us to legalize even just affordable housing in exclusionary areas, so then people have access to these higher opportunities. I think that's so important, because when the Fair Housing Act passed, we downzoned everything. So then communities of color can't move in. And this downzoning is hurting our health. We're not walking around anymore. It is hurting our climate. We're driving everywhere. It is hurting our tech access. It's hurting so many different things. And this is our time to respond. There's heat waves all across the country kind of killing people. So when it comes to climate and racial equity, exclusionary zoning is the main thing that we need to end. And to work with your local CBOs, because they've suffered enough. These communities have suffered a lot in the last 20, 30 years, hundreds of years. And you should work as a local government to right the wrongs of the past. Got to rebuild that house, rebuild that trust. Thank you for having me.
Oh, thank you. Very good points. Everything is interconnected. Your health is related to where you live, related to your educational opportunities, and so appreciate those comments. So I just want to, we are a little bit over time, but thank you guys for staying with us. I want to say a big thank you to all of our panelists on the line. Really appreciate your time and you sharing your expertise with all of us. And thank you to everybody on the line that joined us this afternoon to hear a little bit more about the fair housing laws and requirements and how we can hopefully collectively move the needle in this space to create more fair and equitable communities. So thank you, everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum.